Pennsylvania, 1945. Spring light filtered through tall windows of a military hospital, casting long shadows across polished linoleum floors that smelled of soap and disinfectant. 23 German girls stood in a corridor, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the examination room door. The youngest was 14, the oldest 19. None had seen a doctor in 3 years. Their hair hung dull and lifeless. Their skin stretched thin over bones that jutted at angles the nurses tried not to stare at. When Dr. Margaret Sullivan stepped into the hallway, clipboard in hand, white coat crisp against the morning light, one girl whispered in broken English, "Will you hurt me if I cry?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Sullivan stopped. Her pen paused above the paper. She had examined soldiers with shrapnel wounds, bomber crews with frostbite, Marines who'd seen things no man should see. But this was different. These weren't warriors. They were children. And they were asking permission to feel pain. "No one here will hurt you," Sullivan said, her voice steady but soft. "Not for crying. Not for anything." The girl who'd spoken later, identified in medical records as Greta K., age 16, nodded, but didn't meet the doctor's eyes. Behind her, the others shifted their weight, bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. They wore donated clothes that hung loose. Oversized men's shirts, trousers rolled at the ankles, sweaters with stretched collars. Nothing fit. Everything was temporary. They had arrived at Fort Indiantown Gap 3 days earlier. The convoy from New York Harbor had taken 6 hours, winding through Pennsylvania countryside, where dogwood bloomed white against green hillsides and children played in yards behind white picket fences. The girls had pressed their faces to the bus windows, silent, watching a world that looked nothing like the one they'd left behind. No rubble, no craters, no smoke rising from distant fires. Just green fields and farmhouses with laundry hanging on lines and cows grazing in pastures that stretched to horizons unmarked by war. The journey to America had been longer. 4 weeks aboard a converted cargo ship, crossing an Atlantic still dangerous, with mines floating like ghost seeds beneath the surface. They'd slept in holds designed for ammunition, ate from mess kits stamped with U.S. Army markings, and listened to the engines thrum through steel walls while the ship rolled and pitched through waters that seemed endless. Most had never seen an ocean before. Some had never left their villages until the regime's forces came recruiting. Now they stood in a Pennsylvania hospital, waiting for examination, and the youngest ones were crying without sound. Dr. Sullivan had read their files. Sketchy histories compiled from Red Cross reports and military intelligence. Most had worked in munitions factories near Leipzig and Dresden. 12-hour shifts assembling shell casings, packing explosives, calibrating fuses. Work the regime called essential. Work that made children enemies in the eyes of Allied bombers. When the factories collapsed under strategic strikes in February, the girls had been evacuated to detention facilities where food grew scarce and medical care evaporated, like morning dew under summer sun. By the time American forces liberated the camps in March, the girls were suffering from malnutrition, untreated infections, dental decay, and something the doctors couldn't quantify with instruments: profound psychological exhaustion. The medical protocol was clear. Every prisoner required examination within 72 hours of arrival. Weight, height, vital signs, dental inspection, disease screening, injury assessment. The Army needed data. Statistics for reports that would travel up chains of command to generals and bureaucrats who made decisions about resource allocation and repatriation schedules. But Sullivan understood that for these girls, the examination meant something else entirely. It meant strange hands touching bodies that had learned to associate authority with pain. It meant vulnerability in a language they barely spoke, in a country they'd been taught to fear. "We'll go one at a time," Sullivan said. "No rush. If you need to stop, we stop." The first girl entered the examination room, like someone approaching a gallows. Her name was Liesel, and according to her file, she was 17, though she looked younger. Hunger had erased the softness of adolescence, leaving angles where curves should have been. She sat on the examination table, hands gripping the edge, knuckles white against brown skin, still tanned from summer work outdoors. Sullivan began with simple questions: name, age, home city. Questions designed to establish routine, to make the moment feel bureaucratic rather than threatening. But Liesel's answers came in fragments, broken English mixed with German words she couldn't translate. Yes, she had worked in factory. No, she had not been sick with fever. Yes, her stomach hurt sometimes. No, she did not know why. The physical examination revealed what the questions couldn't capture. Liesel weighed 89 pounds 40 pounds below healthy weight for her height. Her gums bled when Sullivan examined her teeth. 3 molars showed signs of untreated cavities. Her skin bore the faded marks of old bruises, yellow-green shadows that mapped a history of falls, collisions, the casual violence of overcrowded spaces and exhausted bodies. When Sullivan pressed a stethoscope to Liesel's chest, the girl flinched, eyes squeezing shut, breath catching. "You're safe," Sullivan whispered. "Just listening to your heart." Liesel opened her eyes. Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and fast. She wiped them with the back of her hand, leaving wet streaks across her face. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not mean to cry. You don't need to apologize." "But I was told." Liesel stopped. Her jaw tightened. Whatever she'd been told, whatever instructions she'd internalized during 3 years in factories and camps, she couldn't articulate them in English. But Sullivan understood. The girl had learned that emotions were weaknesses, that tears invited punishment, that crying made you a target. This pattern repeated through the morning. Each girl who entered the examination room carried the same tension. Each flinched at first contact. Each apologized for reactions they couldn't control. Anna cried when Sullivan examined her hands, fingers scarred from factory work. Marguerite trembled during the dental inspection, whispering "please no" in German when Sullivan approached with instruments. Helga refused to remove her shirt until Sullivan explained 3 times that the examination required only a brief check of heart and lungs, that the girl could keep her arms crossed over her chest, that privacy would be maintained. By noon, Sullivan had examined 12 girls. The data accumulated on her clipboard: average weight 78 pounds, average height 62 inches, universal signs of malnutrition, widespread dental decay, multiple cases of anemia, 2 suspected cases of tuberculosis requiring isolation and further testing. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real findings existed in spaces between statistics, in the way these girls held themselves, the questions they asked, the permissions they sought. "Can I drink the water?" One girl asked. "All of it? Will we be sent back?" Another whispered. "Do you have bread?" The nurses who assisted Sullivan, Lieutenant Barbara Hayes, and Corporal Ruth Kimmel, moved through the examinations with practiced efficiency, but even they felt the weight of these encounters. Hayes, who'd served in field hospitals in France, later wrote in her diary, "These children have forgotten what kindness looks like. When you smile at them, they flinch. When you offer food, they hoard it in their pockets. They've learned that generosity is a trap, that softness is followed by violence. Teaching them otherwise will take years." The afternoon brought different challenges. 3 girls refused examination entirely. They sat in the waiting area, arms crossed, faces turned toward the wall, answering no questions, accepting no reassurances. Sullivan didn't push. She understood that for some, the loss of control over one's own body was the final indignity in a long series of indignities. To force examination, even gentle, medically necessary examination, would replicate the very dynamics these girls were trying to escape. Instead, Sullivan sat with them. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions. just sat in a chair against the wall, clipboard resting in her lap, and waited. The silence stretched. Outside, afternoon sun slanted through windows, painting golden rectangles on the floor. Somewhere distant, a radio played swing music, a sound drifting through walls like something from another world. After 20 minutes, one girl, Frida, age 15, spoke. "My mother," she said in German. A nurse quickly translated. "I have not heard from my mother since January." Sullivan nodded. "We can help you find her. The Red Cross has lists." "She is alive?" "I don't know, but we'll search." Frida considered this. Her hands unclenched slightly. "If I let you examine me, you will help me search?" "I'll help you search regardless." The girl seemed not to understand this concept. Help without conditions. Care without cost. She looked at Sullivan with an expression that might have been suspicion or might have been hope impossible to distinguish between the two. "Why?" Frida asked. It was the simplest question and the hardest to answer. Why care for enemy children? Why offer medical treatment to girls who'd assembled shells that killed American soldiers? Why show compassion to representatives of a regime that had shown none? Sullivan could have cited Geneva Conventions, military protocols, humanitarian principles. Instead, she told the truth. "Because you're children," Sullivan said. "And children shouldn't have to beg for kindness." Frida stood, walked to the examination room, submitted to the weight check, the vital signs, the dental inspection. She didn't speak during the examination, but when it ended, she said 2 words in English: "Thank you." By evening, 20 girls had been examined. 3 remained. They would be seen the following day. Sullivan wrote her report by lamplight in the officers' quarters, documenting findings that would shape medical protocols for thousands of German prisoners arriving in coming months. But her mind kept returning to that first question. Will you hurt me if I cry? The question revealed an entire education system. Not the formal schooling of classrooms and textbooks, but the brutal pedagogy of wartime detention, where lessons were taught through hunger and exhaustion, and the casual enforcement of rules that made no sense. These girls had learned that tears were provocations, that pain was meant to be endured silently, that weakness invited exploitation. They had learned these lessons so thoroughly that even in safety, even surrounded by people whose stated mission was their care, the old reflexes persisted. Sullivan understood that medical examination was only the beginning. These girls needed food, rest, treatment for infections and deficiencies that threatened permanent damage. But they also needed something harder to prescribe: the gradual, painful process of unlearning fear. They needed time to discover that kindness wasn't a trick, that crying didn't invite punishment, that asking for help wouldn't be used against them. This education couldn't be rushed. It would unfold over months, maybe years, in small moments of repeated gentleness that slowly rebuilt trust in human decency. The next morning brought new challenges. 2 girls, Clara and Ing, both 16, arrived at the hospital coughing blood. The suspected tuberculosis cases had worsened overnight. They were immediately isolated, placed in a separate ward where sunlight flooded through south-facing windows, and the air smelled of pine disinfectant. Treatment began: rest, nutrition, experimental antibiotic regimens that showed promise in early trials. But recovery would be slow. TB didn't respect urgency. Meanwhile, the remaining examinations continued. The last 3 girls, Sophia, Renata, and Eva, presented together, holding hands like children crossing a busy street. They'd formed a unit during factory work, sleeping in adjacent bunks, sharing food when rations ran short, protecting each other from the predatory dynamics that emerged in spaces governed by scarcity. Now they refused separation. Sullivan allowed it. All 3 girls entered the examination room together. They took turns on the table while the others watched, a silent pact of mutual witness. What one endured, all endured. What one survived, all survived. Sophia went first. She was the oldest, 19, and carried herself with a brittle competence that suggested she'd been responsible for younger siblings before the war. Her examination revealed chronic anemia, vitamin deficiencies, and a partially healed fracture in her left wrist sustained, she explained haltingly, when machinery malfunctioned in the factory. No one had set the bone properly. It had healed crooked, limiting her range of motion. Surgery could correct this, Sullivan explained. An orthopedic specialist could reset the bone, restore function. How much does this cost? Sophia asked. Nothing. You're in military custody. Medical care is provided. Sophia looked at her friends. Something passed between them, a shared recognition that this world operated on different principles than the one they'd known. Renata, examining next, cried during the dental inspection, not from pain, but from the realization that the cavities she'd endured for 2 years could actually be treated. Ava, the youngest at 14, fell asleep during her examination, exhaustion overwhelming fear, her body finally permitting rest in a space that felt, tentatively, safe. By mid-morning, all 23 girls had been examined. The data compiled into reports that traveled through military bureaucracy, informing decisions about food allocations, medical supplies, repatriation schedules. But for Sullivan and her staff, the numbers were inadequate. They documented symptoms, but missed the human dimension. The way Greta smiled when offered seconds at lunch. The way Liesel asked if she could write a letter home. The way Helga spent an hour in the shower simply standing under hot water that didn't run out. These moments didn't appear in official reports, but they mattered more than statistics. They were small indicators of psychological thaw, signs that these girls were beginning to understand they'd crossed into different territory. Not just geographically from Germany to America, but existentially. From a world governed by scarcity and punishment to one with excess and, tentatively, care. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Trust, once shattered, rebuilds slowly. Greta still hoarded food in her pockets. Marguerite still flinched when doors opened suddenly. Anna still asked permission before using the bathroom, unable to break the habit of regulated movement. But gradually, incrementally, new patterns emerged. The girls ate meals without looking over their shoulders. They laughed, tentatively at first, then with increasing ease. They asked questions about America. Was all the food always available? Did everyone have hot water? Were there really schools where children didn't work? Lieutenant Hayes organized activities. English lessons in the morning, craft sessions in the afternoon, evening gatherings where the girls could talk or read or simply sit in silence. The goal wasn't assimilation, but acclimatization, helping these children understand. They'd entered a world with different rules, different possibilities, different futures than the ones they'd imagined. Medical treatment continued. The tuberculosis cases received daily care. Dental work began, addressing cavities and infections that had festered untreated. Sophia's wrist was scheduled for surgical correction. Nutritional supplementation raised weights slowly, carefully, avoiding the dangers of refeeding syndrome that could kill starving bodies suddenly exposed to abundance. Each girl received a physical therapy assessment designed to address muscle atrophy and joint problems from years of repetitive factory labor. But the most important treatment was invisible. It happened in small exchanges. A nurse remembering a girl's name, a doctor asking about nightmares without judgment, a chaplain offering conversation in German with no agenda except listening. These moments accumulated like raindrops filling a well. Slowly, the girls began to believe what they'd been told. They were safe. They could cry. They could ask for help. They could imagine futures beyond survival. 6 weeks after arrival, Sullivan conducted follow-up examinations. The physical changes were dramatic. Average weight had increased to 97 pounds. Hair showed new growth, glossy with proper nutrition. Skin had regained elasticity. Energy levels had improved. The girls moved differently, now less like prey animals, more like adolescents discovering they could take up space without consequences. But the psychological recovery remained incomplete. Nightmares persisted. Hypervigilance continued. Trust remained fragile. Greta still asked, before each meal, if the food would run out. Liesel still watched doors, tracking who entered and exited. Marguerite still spoke in whispers, as if loud voices might summon punishment. These patterns would take years to fade, if they faded at all. War's wounds heal unevenly, and some scars remain permanently visible. Sullivan's final report, submitted in July, documented the medical interventions and their outcomes. But she included something unusual, a section on psychological observations, noting that physical health couldn't be separated from emotional security. She recommended continued mental health support, ongoing monitoring, and gradual integration into civilian life rather than immediate repatriation. Her recommendations were largely ignored. By August, most girls had been transferred to displaced persons camps, awaiting transport back to Germany. The military had protocols. Resources were limited. Sentiment couldn't override logistics. But before departure, each girl received a medical file documenting their treatment. And each received something else, a letter from Sullivan, written in simple English, explaining that what they'd endured wasn't their fault, that they deserved care and dignity, that their futures remained unwritten. Most girls kept these letters. Years later, when historians interviewed survivors, several produced yellowed envelopes, creased from folding and unfolding, proof that someone had seen them not as enemies, but as children. Greta K., the girl who'd asked, "Will you hurt me if I cry?" returned to Germany in September. Red Cross records show she reunited with her mother in Hamburg, attended school, trained as a nurse. In 1953, she wrote to Sullivan a letter that took 6 months to arrive, forwarded through multiple addresses. She thanked the doctor for the examination, for the kindness, for the lesson that crying wasn't weakness, but humanity. She wrote that she'd become a nurse because of Sullivan's example, because she'd learned that medicine was more than procedures and prescriptions. It was the practice of seeing people at their most vulnerable and choosing, despite everything, to be gentle. Sullivan kept that letter until her death in 1982. It sat in her desk drawer, alongside citations and commendations and official recognitions. But when her daughter cleaned out the office, the letter was what she saved, not because of its historical significance, but because of what it represented. A single question, asked by a frightened child in a Pennsylvania hospital, had revealed the essential challenge of post-war recovery, not just rebuilding cities and economies, but reconstructing the basic human capacity for trust. The 23 German girls who passed through Fort Indiantown Gap in spring 1945 were among thousands processed through American military facilities. Their stories weren't unique, but they illuminated something crucial about war's aftermath. Victory wasn't just military defeat of enemy forces. It was the slow, difficult work of helping shattered people discover they could lower their defenses without inviting destruction. It was teaching children who'd learned that tears brought punishment, that emotions were acceptable, natural, human. "Will you hurt me if I cry?" The question echoed through decades, a reminder that war's cruelest achievement was teaching people to fear their own vulnerability. And the answer delivered by doctors, nurses, chaplains, and ordinary soldiers who chose compassion over convenience was the foundation of what came after. No one here will hurt you, not for crying, not for anything. It was a promise often broken in human history, but in those moments, in that Pennsylvania hospital, it was kept. And for 23 girls, it meant everything.